Tonight, we journey into the story of ancient Egypt. You find yourself standing before the slow, silver ribbon of the Nile, its waters gleaming under a crescent moon. Papyrus reeds whisper in the evening breeze. Crocodiles lurk just beyond the rushes, and across the floodplains you see sparks of firelight where the first families of this ancient land settle for the night. Their huts of mud and reeds cling close to the river because the desert presses in on all sides, a vast golden silence that threatens to swallow everything if the Nile ever withdraws. You might struggle to endure what they once lived through: droughts, dangerous wildlife, floods that drowned more than they nourished. And yet, out of this hardship, something extraordinary was beginning to stir. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you'd like, share your location and your local time in the comments. It's soothing to imagine this journey unrolling across time zones like a paper screen. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Nile rises and falls with patient rhythm, a heartbeat older than memory. Each summer, its waters spill beyond the banks, leaving behind rich, black silt, a gift so generous that early settlers began to depend upon it more than on the uncertain rains. You walk beside farmers as they bend over the damp earth, planting barley and emmer wheat with simple sticks, their children shooing away ibises and geese that try to steal the grain. Life here is fragile, but the river promises enough food to support villages and eventually something larger. You notice how the Nile is more than water. It is calendar, compass, and God all at once. People chant prayers to Hapi, the spirit of the flood, whose arrival marks the difference between life and starvation. In their imagination, the Nile is not only a river, but also a divine thread connecting heaven, earth, and the underworld. Later scribes will even describe it as flowing straight from paradise. That reverence is not only poetry, it is survival turned into worship. By day, hunters track hippos and gazelles across the floodplains, while fishermen throw nets glittering in the sun. At night, storytellers by the fire weave myths of falcons and serpents that stalk the river's edge. You might smile at how even then people were trying to explain thunder as the clash of gods, or the stars as the lamps of ancestors. Simple explanations perhaps, but also seeds of a worldview that will one day grow into temples and texts carved in stone. Historians still wonder whether agriculture here began entirely on its own or was sparked by knowledge drifting from Mesopotamia. What's certain is that Egypt's landscape shaped everything. Narrow ribbon of fertile land pressed between endless desert and the steady current of the Nile. That geography encouraged unity because everyone depended on the same heartbeat of water. Unlike other lands where rivers divided people, here the Nile stitched them together. You keep walking southward, where the river carves between cliffs and cataracts, and you see how these natural barriers protect the valley. Nomadic bands pass through, trading flint, beads, and copper, but the Nile people begin to see themselves as unique, guardians of a land unlike any other. Remember this feeling of protection, because later, when outsiders pour in, the Egyptians will cling fiercely to the identity formed here. For now, though, it is the dawn of everything. Villages sprout like islands of life, each with its own leader, its own gods carved in clay, its own rhythms of flood and harvest. No pyramids, no pharaohs yet, only families leaning into the mystery of a river that seems to love them and threaten them in equal measure.
and you, walking barefoot across the damp fields, sense that you are at the beginning of one of history's longest and most luminous journeys.
You rise with the dawn mist, and the Nile gleams pale gold as the first rays of the sun scatter across its surface. Along the banks, smoke curls from hearth fires, and the hush of the morning is broken by the sounds of grinding grain, tethered cattle lowing, and the laughter of children splashing in the shallows. The simple villages you wandered through in the last section are no longer merely collections of huts. They are beginning to pulse with the first hints of organized society. Villages becoming kingdoms. You walk into one such settlement, where elders meet beneath a sycamore fig tree to settle disputes. At first, these gatherings are just small councils, a farmer arguing over grazing rights, or a fisherman accusing another of stealing nets. But gradually, one man's voice carries more weight. A chieftain emerges, a leader who commands respect because of his skill, wealth, or perhaps the mysterious aura people begin to weave around him. These figures become the nomarchs of early Egypt, rulers of their regions, their word edging closer and closer to law. You notice their homes are sturdier, walls of packed mud rising higher, decorated with animal skulls or painted with ochre. Symbols matter deeply here. A simple reed crown may be worn by the leader, a token that says, "I hold the river's blessing." You might smile at how crowns, those funny hats of power, start humbly as reeds and flowers plucked by hand, before evolving into gold and jewels. Even in simplicity, the idea is already there, that rule comes from something sacred. Trade weaves threads between villages, carried in reed boats that glide along the current. Pottery styles shift, spreading from one cluster of homes to another. You see red polished jars from the south, stone vessels from the north, beads of carnelian gleaming like droplets of sunset. With each exchange, people carry not only goods, but also ideas, myths, and rituals. Slowly, villages knit into wider networks. Historians still wonder whether this early centralization was driven mostly by trade or by conflict. Was it the lure of wealth that drew people into the orbit of a stronger leader, or the pressure of raids and disputes that demanded protection? Either way, Egypt begins to fracture into two great regions. Upper Egypt in the south, where the Nile narrows between cliffs, and Lower Egypt in the north, where the river fans into a lush delta like an emerald hand reaching to the sea. You travel south, through villages clustered at the edge of cliffs, their people fierce and proud, their symbols falcons and lotus flowers. You travel north, into the wide marshy lands of the delta, where papyrus and fish are abundant, and the people honor the bee and the papyrus plant as emblems of their rule. Two lands so different in geography and spirit that their eventual meeting will decide the fate of Egyptian history. By now, death has also begun to shape culture. You pass a burial ground where bodies are wrapped in mats of reeds, their possessions tucked beside them, jars of beer, beads, flint, tools. Even in these early days, Egyptians imagine the journey beyond death. The desert sands, dry and unyielding, preserve bodies naturally, and this accidental mummification sparks ideas that the body might be needed again in another life. From such simple burials will rise the vast rituals of pyramids and embalming, but already the seeds are sown.
As you wander, you see walls marked with the earliest carvings, proto-hieroglyphs etched into pottery or ivory tags tied to jars of oil and grain. They are not yet full writing, but they are signs of a people trying to mark ownership, to keep memory. Remember these scratches, for one day they will grow into one of the most enchanting and complex writing systems in the ancient world. At dusk, you stand on a hill overlooking the Nile Valley. Below you, the land glows with firelight. Dozens of villages, each with its chief, each with its gods, each with its ambitions. They are still separate, but the current of the river pulls them towards something larger, as if Egypt itself is waiting to be born.
The sun climbs higher over the Nile, casting long shadows on the fertile fields, and you sense a new kind of tension in the air. Villages have grown strong, chiefs have grown ambitious, and now the land is divided into two great realms. Upper Egypt in the south, its narrow valley shielded by cliffs, and Lower Egypt in the north, its wide delta teeming with life. These two lands, though bound by the river, seem destined to clash. You step carefully along the edge of history, for this is the age of unification, and the figure most often named is Narmer. You wander south first, through Upper Egypt, where warriors polish their flint blades and paint their bodies with ochre. Their banners bear the falcon, symbol of Horus, soaring over their narrow kingdom. Their land is harder, their people more hardened by cliffs and cataracts. Here, unity is forged in the crucible of competition. Chiefs consolidate power, swallow up weaker villages, and emerge as kings of their stretch of the valley. Then you drift north into Lower Egypt, the delta spreading wide and green like a woven mat. Here, the air smells of papyrus, fish, and salt drifting in from the Mediterranean. The people are traders by nature, their lands open, their contacts wider. They wear the red crown, a tall, flat-topped symbol shaped like a chair back, declaring their rule over the marshy land. Upper Egypt wears the white crown, tall, conical, like a milk jug turned upside down. And now, both crowns stand for more than mere regions. They stand for rivals, each dreaming of uniting the whole. You might chuckle softly at how humans everywhere invent hats to prove they're in charge. Yet, these crowns are more than ornaments. They are destiny in woven reeds, later hammered in gold. Historians still debate whether Narmer was truly the first to unify Egypt, or whether another figure, Menes, deserves the title. The evidence is fragmentary. Palettes of stone carved with symbols, lists written centuries later, legends blurred with memory. But the Narmer palette survives, and you see it in your mind's eye. A slab of gray-green siltstone, where a king in the white crown smites an enemy, while in another scene he wears the red crown. Two lands, two crowns, one ruler. Whether myth or fact, the story endures. You walk beside Narmer as he strides north, his armies carrying maces, spears, and banners crowned with animal emblems. Dust rises, sandals pound the earth, and you feel the tension of a decisive moment. Was this a single great battle, or a slow merging of regions through marriages, treaties, and threats? Historians still wonder. But in the quiet of the Nile evening, you sense that the land itself longs for unity. The unification is not just political, it is cosmic. Egyptians believe their land must be whole, a mirror of the heavens. Two lands,
two gods, two crowns fused into one duality. From now on, every pharaoh will wear the double crown, blending white and red, a symbol of eternal balance. Even the title, King of Upper and Lower Egypt, will echo across thousands of years, reminding each ruler that they hold not just power, but the sacred duty of harmony. In the aftermath, Memphis rises, near the boundary between north and south. Imagine its foundations laid where the river branches, a city meant to guard the unity and proclaim it to the world. Memphis will stand for millennia, its walls ringing with hymns, its palaces humming with scribes and priests. And you, standing at its imagined birth, see how unity gives rise to permanence. As the stars prick the sky that night, villagers across the land look toward Memphis, murmuring the name of the new king. They may not fully grasp the scale of change, but they feel it. A single ruler, a single Egypt, a destiny flowing like the Nile itself. And you, watching from the riverbank, sense the first spark of empire glowing in the twilight.
You follow the river as stone replaces mud and ambition hardens into geometry. The newly unified land settles into certainty, and in that certainty, the kings dream in limestone. This is the Old Kingdom, an age when authority turns skyward and the horizon sprouts steps and smooth faces that reach for eternity. At Saqqara, you walk with Djoser, a ruler who dares to stack the horizon. His architect, Imhotep, physician, priest, and later a god, guides hands that set the first great monument in stone, the Step Pyramid. It is a radical act, turning perishable mud into a permanent staircase. One key fact steadies you. Here, statecraft becomes architecture, and stone learns to obey. You drift through the royal precinct and see a city of workers bloom like an oasis. Masons, coppersmiths, bakers, brewers, water carriers, foremen with reed pens. Rations come as bread and beer, the taste of the Nile transformed into calories. If spreadsheets existed now, the quartermaster would sleep with one under his pillow. Instead, ink tallies track who carried what and when. Organization itself becomes a tool as sharp as any chisel. The pyramid is not just a tomb, it is a diagram of belief. Egyptians speak of the Benben, the first mound rising from primeval waters, and say the pyramid's slope echoes the sun's rays. You tip your head back and let your eyes climb those angles, and you feel how the shape itself becomes a prayer. Ma'at, cosmic balance, requires the king to be steady as stone. Travel on with Sneferu, the master experimenter. At Medum, a ruin whispers of lessons learned. At Dashur, the bent pyramid changes angle midway, as though even ambition must catch its breath. Then comes the red pyramid, clean planes at a calm pitch, the first true pyramid. You might smile at how even Pharaohs prototype, revise, and ship version 3. Historians still wonder whether structural caution or theology dictated those angles, but the result is unmistakable. Egypt has perfected a form. North at Giza, Khufu raises a mountain. The Great Pyramid lifts millions of blocks in disciplined ranks, and for nearly 4,000 years it will stand as the tallest human-made thing. That is your second key fact tonight. Height as a message, authority measured in cubits and sweat.
Inside, narrow passages lead to chambers whose alignment tempts every stargazer's heart. Historians still wonder whether ventilation or stellar symbolism guided those shafts. Khafre follows, his own pyramid gleaming in the sun, and a guardian takes its watch, the Great Sphinx, lion body, human head, a riddle carved into bedrock. Was it Khafre's face? Khufu's? A recut of something older? Historians still wonder. You lay your palm against the rock and feel it holding the day's warmth for night watch duty. Even the grandest monuments need a good skincare routine. Menkaure adds a more modest pyramid, proof that scale is not the only register of power. Around these peaks spreads a grid of mastabas, flat-roofed tombs, where nobles cluster in the pharaoh's afterlife neighborhood. Reliefs show bakers, dancers, boatmen. The living and the dead meet in carved scenes that insist life should be complete, even when it is finished. You pause at a worker's village and watch a doctor set a splint and a brewer tap a jar. These are not iron-chained slaves, but teams of skilled laborers, conscripted seasonally when the Nile's flood idles fields. Songs pace the hauling, ramps inch forward. The city breathes with the rise. Historians still wonder whether every hand here was free or bound by duty, but the rhythm of labor feels communal, and the rations taste like a good day's wage. Administration thickens to matchstone. Nomarchs report to visors, visors to the king to the gods, or claims to be one. Grain tax pours into granaries, whose walls puff out like full lungs. Bureaucracy seems unromantic until you stand beneath a ceiling of painted stars and realize paperwork keeps heaven aligned. Somewhere a clerk prays that the cosmic ledger balances by year's end. Religion concentrates. The solar cult of Ra grows powerful. The pharaoh becomes son of Ra, a title that fuses crown and sun. Said festivals renew royal vigor. After decades on the throne, the king performs rituals of sprinting and strength to signal divine fitness. You watch the pageant and wonder how many knees complain behind those perfect smiles. Symbols multiply. The flail and crook cross on the chest, shepherd and thresher, mercy and discipline. Down corridors, you glimpse the earliest pyramid texts, spells carved on stone to guide the king through the sky. Words become ladders. Vowels sleep in the lines like quiet fish. Consonants carry the soul. Remember the proto-signs scratched on jars? Here they bloom into theology, an alphabet of ascent. The promise is simple and immense. The king joins the circumpolar stars, the ones that never set, and in that revolving, Egypt's order endures. Walk the causeways that link valley temples to the pyramids, stone corridors once lined with processions and incense. In the cool shade, you picture priests washing statues, opening doors to the dawn, and setting out small boats for the solar bark, a reminder that the king will sail with Ra across the heavens. Remember the double crown we met at unification? Here its promise is kept. Upper and Lower Egypt arrive together in ritual, two lands braided like the Nile itself, their offerings rising in a single column of song. Yet, even in confidence, hairline cracks form. The cost of stone is measured not only in copper chisels, but also in strain. Nomarchs grow proud, temples grow rich, and the crown must negotiate with its own creations. Historians still wonder whether climate shifts, poor floods, or palace politics thinned the Old Kingdom's strength first. Night settles on Giza. The pyramids turn from gold to violet to a deep, restful black. Stars catch on edges, and for a moment the shapes seem to float, as if the desert were water again, and these were boats moored to the sky. You breathe slow and even, and let the scale be a lullaby. Human hands, guided by belief, making the horizon hold its breath. The kings you follow fall quiet within their chambers, but their geometry keeps speaking about order, ambition, and the patient conversation between earth and sky.
The night air over Giza feels heavy, not from the stone monuments, but from a subtle shift. You sense that the ground beneath this proud kingdom is beginning to soften. The pyramids stand immovable, yet behind their grandeur, the machinery of Egypt strains. What was once harmony begins to tremble, and you step into the slow unraveling historians call the First Intermediate Period. It starts with the floods. The Nile, so steady for centuries, falters. Some years the water rises too little, leaving crops to wither in the fields. Other years the flood comes too high, sweeping huts and silos into the current. You watch anxious farmers scam the river's edge, praying for Hapi's gift, yet carrying doubt in their hearts. A single failed harvest means hunger. A string of them means famine. One key fact steadies here. Egypt's order, its very survival, is as fragile as the annual rhythm of a river. With famine comes fracture. Nomarchs, those local governors once subordinate to the pharaoh, begin to act like kings in their own right. You walk into their courts, where they carve inscriptions boasting of generosity. I gave bread to the hungry, water to the thirsty. Some of it may be truth, some propaganda, but all of it signals that power no longer flows only from Memphis. The crown's grip slips like sand through an open hand. Historians still wonder whether climate change or politics weighed heavier in this collapse. Was it the failure of the river, or the bloat of bureaucracy, or rivalries at court? You sense it was everything together. Too many officials, too little grain, too much distance between promise and reality. Art shifts too. Reliefs once filled with kings smiting enemies now show ordinary people baking, weaving, herding goats. Tomb paintings in provincial cemeteries grow more personal, more intimate, almost as if common life itself had stepped into history's spotlight. You might smile at how even decline can democratize. Without a central pyramid project, artists turn to scenes of daily bread, and the texture of real life sneaks into eternity. Religion, too, reshapes. Where once only the king could claim the afterlife among the stars, now ordinary people begin to believe they might join Osiris in the field of reeds. Coffin texts replace the pyramid texts, written not only for kings, but for any who could afford them. You step into a dim burial chamber and see spells inked on wood, prayers that promise the farmer and fisherman the same chance at eternal peace as the pharaoh. What was once exclusive becomes, at least in belief, shared. You drift through towns that feel less tethered. Temples of local gods rise in importance.
crocodile-headed Sobek in one town, feline Bastet in another. Egypt is no longer one song, but a chorus of regional voices. To the north, rulers in Heracleopolis claim legitimacy. To the south, Thebes grows restless with ambition. The Nile is still the thread, but the fabric frays. Yet in this time of hardship, resilience flickers. You hear tales of nomarchs digging canals to ease drought or building grain silos to buffer famine. In their tomb inscriptions, they remind future readers that even in chaos, they cared for their people. Was this boast or truth? Historians still wonder. Perhaps both. But even propaganda can teach. The ideal of leadership had shifted from divine aloofness to practical care. At dusk, you sit by a fire with peasants chewing dry bread, their laughter thin but still present. They joke about the river being lazy, about officials with big titles and empty granaries. It reminds you that even when kingdoms collapse, people endure with humor. Maybe that's the quiet strength of history. The laughter around small fires outlasts the thunder of palaces. As the stars blink awake, you realize this age, though called intermediate, is not merely a pause. It is a turning, a recalibration. Egypt is learning that kings may falter, but its culture, its stories, its gods, its people remains stubbornly alive. And from these ashes, another kingdom waits to rise.
The night sky over the Nile seems softer now, as though Egypt itself is gathering strength after years of drought and division. You drift southward, and there, in Thebes, you sense a heartbeat returning. This is the dawn of the Middle Kingdom, a period less flamboyant than the Pyramid Age, yet steadier, wiser, and in many ways more human. Villages and towns that once bowed to rival lords are brought together again under a single rule, and Egypt learns the art of renewal. You walk beside Mentuhotep II, a king of Thebes, as he marches north to end the disunity. His victory reunites the two lands, and with it, a new style of kingship takes shape. The pharaoh is no longer only a distant sun god enthroned in divine solitude. He is also a shepherd of people, a caretaker expected to provide stability. This is your first key fact here. The Middle Kingdom redefines kingship, tempering majesty with responsibility. At Deir el-Bahri, you climb the terraces of Mentuhotep's mortuary complex, rows of colonnades rising from the desert cliffs, blending stone with mountain. It is not a pyramid, but something new, architecture that harmonizes with the natural world. You feel a quiet wisdom here, a recognition that eternity does not always need to pierce the sky. Sometimes it rests in balance with Earth itself. Administration grows stronger too. Canals are dug to tame the floodwaters, silos swell with grain, and governors keep closer ties to the crown. You hear scribes scratching away, their ink on papyrus capturing not only taxes but also tales. One cultural tidbit glimmers in your ear. This is the age when literature flourishes, when Egyptians begin to write stories that reflect both fear and hope. The tale of the shipwrecked sailor, the instructions of Amenemhat, the eloquent laments of farmers. These voices echo across the centuries.
You might smile at how even then people enjoyed a good story about someone surviving disaster with a clever twist. Trade pulses outward. Caravans march through the Sinai to bring turquoise and copper. Boats sail south to Nubia for gold and ivory, and expeditions reach to Punt, the God's land, where incense and exotic animals astonish those back home. The Nile hums with activity, its banks alive with warehouses, workshops, and bustling markets. The river is no longer only a giver of grain, it is a highway of ambition. Religion shifts again. Osiris, once only a god of kings, becomes a god for everyone. You step into a small tomb and see painted scenes of farmers plowing lush fields in the afterlife, families feasting in eternal harvest. The promise of paradise is no longer reserved for the elite. It belongs to all who honor Ma'at and live justly. This democratization of eternity is perhaps the Middle Kingdom's most tender gift. Historians still wonder how much of this stability rested on diplomacy and how much on iron control. The kings of the 12th dynasty, like Senuseret and Amenemhat, ruled firmly, even harshly at times. They built fortresses in Nubia to guard trade and mines, canals to control the flood, and colossal statues to proclaim strength. Was this benevolent guidance or centralized grip? Perhaps both. Security rarely comes with strings. You stroll through a workers' village near a temple site and hear laughter over beer jars. Even ordinary Egyptians feel a measure of prosperity, their lives steadier than in the chaos before. Art reflects this. Statues show kings with lined faces, heavy-lidded eyes, as if wariness and realism have replaced the perfect masks of the Old Kingdom. It is a subtle honesty, an admission that rulers are human too. At twilight, you stand on the banks of the Nile and watch a barge drift past, its cargo piled high with grain, its sails catching the evening breeze. The sun sets in bands of gold and crimson, and the river glows with a sense of order restored. The Middle Kingdom is not a time of spectacular heights like the Great Pyramid, but of deeper balance. And you, leaning on the railing of the barge, feel Egypt exhale, stronger, humbler, and ready to endure.
The steady calm of the Middle Kingdom cannot last forever. As you drift along the Nile, you sense new winds blowing from beyond Egypt's borders. Winds carrying strange faces, new weapons, and unsettling power. This is the time of the Hyksos, foreign rulers who disrupt the valley's rhythm and change Egypt forever. At first, their presence seems quiet. Traders from the Levant arrive with donkeys burdened by goods, fine oils, new kinds of pottery, curious trinkets. Egyptians welcome exchange, as they always have. But slowly, groups settle in the delta, their numbers growing, their customs distinct. They bring new gods, new words, and, most striking of all, new technology. You might chuckle when you imagine Egyptians seeing a horse for the first time, half curious, half terrified, and entirely unprepared. One key fact here: the Hyksos introduced horses and the chariot, transforming Egyptian warfare. You stand on the edge of a dusty plain and watch a Hyksos warband ride past. Chariots rattling, wheels flashing, horses snorting with a power Egyptians had never harnessed before.
In an instant, the old ways of combat seem outdated, like trading in a reed boat for a ship with sails. Historians still wonder whether the Hyksos swept in violently or seeped in gradually through trade and settlement until their dominance was unavoidable. Was it a sudden invasion, or did Egypt simply wake one day to find foreigners already in charge of the delta? The evidence blurs, but the effect is clear. Egypt, once master of its borders, bows to outsiders. You wander through Avaris, the Hyksos capital in the delta. It feels different from Thebes or Memphis. Houses with Levantine styles, temples to gods unfamiliar to Egyptian eyes. Yet here too, life goes on. Markets bustle, children laugh, and farmers sow fields. Occupation is rarely simple. Many Egyptians serve in Hyksos courts, learning their ways, even benefiting from new tools. You might smile at how cultural borrowing often hides inside the shadow of conquest. But in Thebes, resentment grows. The southern kings, reduced to vassals, plot in temples and whisper in tombs. You walk among their priests who murmur prayers to Amun, the hidden god, whose cult is swelling with defiance. Thebes becomes a crucible of resistance, its rulers dreaming not only of independence, but of revenge. One cultural tidbit gleams here. In this period, Egyptians adopt the composite bow, a weapon far stronger than their old simple bows. Along with chariots, it will become a cornerstone of military might. Ironically, Egypt's future empire is forged from the very tools brought by foreign rulers. The invaders are teachers as much as enemies. The struggle takes decades. You hear tales of Sekenenre Tau, who fights the Hyksos and, according to legend, bears terrible wounds to prove it. His successors, Kamos and Amos, press the bow harder. Night after night, their armies creep north, reclaiming towns, fortresses, and eventually sweeping into the delta itself. The clash is brutal, though spared in this gentle telling, but decisive. At last, the Hyksos are expelled, their chariots captured, their influence absorbed. Historians still wonder about the scale of this war, whether it was drawn out and devastating or swift and concentrated. But the result is unmistakable. Egypt emerges not weakened, but sharpened. When the dust settles, you find yourself standing in Thebes once more. Incense rises in Amun's temple. Victory hymns echo through the halls. And Amos I is crowned pharaoh. The Hyksos are gone, but their legacy remains in every Egyptian chariot, every fortress, every bow strung tight. Egypt has endured occupation, learned from it, and is now prepared to surge outward with new strength. As the night folds around the river, you realize this was no mere interruption. It was a transformation. Egypt has been invaded, humbled, and yet renewed. The Nile flows on, carrying not just silt, but the memory of resilience. And you, watching its waters gleam in the starlight, sense that the greatest age of Egypt is about to dawn.
The Nile glimmers beneath the dawn, and you feel the energy shift again. This time, not into collapse, but into expansion. Egypt, reborn from the Hyksos struggle, now bursts forward with confidence. This is the new kingdom, the golden empire of mighty pharaohs, sprawling temples, and conquests that stretch far beyond the valley's narrow cradle. You march with Amos I as he celebrates victory, the founder of the 18th dynasty.
His successors seize the moment. No longer content to guard Egypt's borders, they strike outward, into Nubia for gold, into the Levant for timber and trade routes. Egypt becomes not just a kingdom, but an empire, its chariots racing across desert and plain. The Hyksos taught them the art of war, and now Egypt perfects it. One key fact steadies your steps here. The new kingdom is the age of Egypt's greatest expansion, its armies reaching as far north as the Euphrates. You picture Thutmose III, the Napoleon of Egypt, commanding at Megiddo. His troops march in disciplined ranks, banners snapping, chariots lined like thunderclouds. Inscriptions boast of victory, lists of spoils, and hundreds of captured cities. Whether the numbers are inflated or not, the confidence is real. Egypt is no longer vulnerable, but dominant. Back in Thebes, wealth flows in. Temples expand like forests of stone. At Karnak, you walk between rows of ram-headed sphinxes, leading to colossal gateways. Inside, hypostyle halls bloom with massive columns carved like papyrus stalks, their tops flaring open like flowers toward the sky. Priests in white linen whisper hymns as incense curls, while rays of sunlight slip through narrow slits, painting hieroglyphs with gold. This is not architecture for humans alone. It is a theater for gods. Historians still wonder whether power truly rested with the pharaoh or with the priesthood of Amun, whose temple at Karnak became wealthy enough to rival the crown. The tension is palpable. Kings build bigger temples to assert authority. Priests grow stronger within them. Egypt's brilliance carries within it seeds of rivalry. One cultural tidbit sparkles in the quiet. This is the age when obelisks rise, slender needles of granite, polished until they catch the dawn. They symbolize the sun's first light, frozen in stone. You might smile at how a simple pillar could become a marvel, but then you step closer and see the inscriptions, royal names, prayers, records of triumph. Even stone becomes a voice here, speaking across millennia. And then comes Hatshepsut. You walk beside her as she dons the false beard of kingship, daring to rule as a female pharaoh. At Deir el-Bahri, her mortuary temple unfolds in terraces against the cliffs, a masterpiece of grace and ambition. Reliefs show her ships sailing to Punt, bringing back incense trees planted in temple courtyards. You might smile at how she turned trade into theater, every exotic animal and fragrant resin a symbol of legitimacy. Historians still debate whether her reign was one of peace or masked rivalries, but her monuments whisper a truth. She ruled, and she left her mark. Later, Amenhotep III presides over an age of dazzling wealth. His colossi of Memnon rise like twin guardians in the west, and letters from his court reveal diplomacy with kings from Babylon and Hatti. Gifts of gold, promises of daughters in marriage, treaties written in cuneiform, all flow into Egypt's orbit. You wander through palace gardens, hearing laughter, music, and the plash of fountains. This is Egypt at its most cosmopolitan. But in the distance, you sense strange currents stirring, visions of a single sun disk, a king named Akhenaten waiting to upend the order. Still, for now, the empire glows. Chariots patrol its borders, temples rise higher, and the Nile carries barges heavy with spoils. The new kingdom is Egypt's high noon, brilliant, confident, and unstoppable. And you, standing in the golden haze, feel the weight of history pressing forward towards both glory and disruption.
The sun blazes over Thebes, and you feel its heat sharpen, almost too bright, too insistent. It is as though the very light itself demands devotion. That is exactly what happens. For now Egypt falls under the spell of Akhenaten, the heretic king, who dares to reshape faith, art, and even the capital city. You walk into a world turned sideways, where old gods are cast aside and the sun disk reigns alone. Akhenaten begins as Amenhotep IV, son of Amenhotep III, but something in him hungers for a different vision. Soon he renames himself Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, and declares the Aten, the radiant sun disk, to be the one true God. Temples of Amun fall quiet, statues pulled down, priests dismissed. This is your key fact. Akhenaten introduces the first known monotheistic experiment in recorded history. A revolution so startling it will ripple far beyond his reign. You walk into Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, the new capital he builds at Amarna. The city rises almost overnight. Wide boulevards, open-air temples without roofs, so sunlight pours directly on the altars. Palaces where courtiers rush about with nervous excitement. Unlike the shadowy sanctuaries of Karnak, these temples breathe light. Hymns to Aten echo everywhere, describing him as the giver of life to all lands, not just Egypt. You tilt your head back, and the sun glares down, making you squint. Perhaps the point all along. Historians still wonder whether Akhenaten's faith was true conviction or political maneuver. Was he a visionary prophet swept away by devotion, or a king trying to break the power of the Amun priesthood by creating his own god? The debate lingers, like sunlight shifting across stone. Art transforms too. Gone are the stiff, perfect pharaohs of old. Instead, you see elongated figures, soft bellies, tender embraces. Akhenaten is depicted with narrow face, wide hips, long fingers. Nefertiti, his queen, appears beside him as equal, radiant in her famous blue crown. Together, they cradle their daughters beneath the rays of Aten, each beam ending in a tiny hand offering life. This intimacy shocks you. A royal family displayed not as aloof gods, but as tender parents. You might smile at the domesticity, even joke that the world's first family photo album was carved in stone. And yet, beneath this warmth, unease stirs. Ordinary Egyptians still whisper prayers to Amun, Osiris, and Hathor in secret. Old gods do not vanish so easily. Tomb workers scratch hidden symbols into walls, ensuring the balance of the afterlife survives this experiment. You wander into a half-finished burial chamber at Amarna and feel the tension. Sunlight devotion above, traditional fears lingering below. One cultural tidbit lingers sweetly. Akhenaten's great hymn to the Aten, a poetic prayer praising the sun's rising and setting, survives on temple walls. Its rhythm feels almost modern, celebrating not just kingship, but the sheer wonder of light and life. Read aloud, it feels less like theology and more like awe. Perhaps in that, Akhenaten's sincerity flickers through. But revolutions are fragile. Grain runs short, enemies press at borders, and the empire strains while the king gazes heavenward. The people murmur, the priests seethe. And when Akhenaten dies, his vision fades with him. Temples are abandoned, statues smashed, his name chiseled away in a campaign of erasure. Historians still debate whether his successors despised him or merely sought to restore stability. Either way, the old gods return, stronger than before. As you step out of the ruined city of Amarna, you feel a strange melancholy. The streets are empty, the temples roofless and silent, the great dream of Aten scattered like dust. Yet in that silence, the memory of his vision lingers. A man who dared to imagine one god blazing in the sky, and in doing so, left Egypt forever changed.
The dust of Amarna settles, and Egypt exhales, weary of experiments. Out of the wreckage of Akhenaten's vision rises a boy, a child king whose reign is brief, yet whose name will echo louder than almost any other pharaoh. You walk softly into this moment, for here stands Tutankhamun, the golden boy who restores tradition and, centuries later, will capture the world's imagination. Tutankhamun ascends the throne at around 9 years old, guided by powerful advisors like Ai and Horemheb. The first act of his reign is a reversal. The capital shifts back to Thebes, temples of Amun reopen, and the Aten cult is quietly dismantled. Your key fact here is simple. Tutankhamun restored the old gods, ending Egypt's flirtation with monotheism and soothing a nation eager for balance. You watch as craftsmen return to work in Karnak, chiseling Amun's name once again into stone. Priests chant familiar hymns, incense smokes rise, and the people breathe easier. It is as though the Nile itself flows more smoothly when the gods are back in harmony. You might smile at how human beings cling to the comfort of the familiar, especially after a season of upheaval. Tutankhamun is young, almost fragile in appearance, but his image is everywhere. Reliefs show him hunting, leading armies, and making offerings, though in truth much of this is ceremony. Historians still wonder how much he truly ruled and how much was decided by those behind the throne. Yet his presence alone, crowned and radiant, becomes a symbol of restoration. Art flourishes again in traditional style, yet tinged with gentleness. You notice scenes of Tutankhamun and his young queen, Ankhesenamun, daughters of Akhenaten, holding hands, tender and human. This intimacy carries a whisper of the Amarna style, but now set within the old order, a fusion of experiment and tradition. One cultural tidbit that sparkles: Tutankhamun's treasures, sealed away in his modest tomb, were never meant to astonish the world millennia later. Yet among them lies the golden death mask, gleaming with lapis eyes and serene expression. You imagine slipping into the Valley of the Kings, where his tomb was hastily prepared, far smaller than those of grander rulers, yet filled with a staggering wealth of objects. Beds shaped like lions, golden shrines, miniature boats, even toys, reminders of a boy's short life. You walk the narrow corridors of his tomb, torchlight flickering on painted walls. Scenes show him embraced by Osiris, guided into the afterlife. The air feels still, as if the chamber has been waiting, patient for discovery. Centuries later, Howard Carter will kneel here and whisper, "Yes, wonderful things." But for now, the tomb is sealed, the boy king asleep in eternal gold.
Historians still wonder about his death. Was it an accident? An infection from a broken leg? A disease? Some imagine intrigue at court, but the evidence is unclear. You shake your head softly. Perhaps it was simply frailty, the short candle of a fragile life in a turbulent age. Yet Tutankhamun's importance does not rest on conquest or long reigns. Instead, it rests on memory. His reign marked a return to balance after chaos, and his tomb, miraculously undisturbed for millennia, became a time capsule of Egypt's golden world. You might smile at how fate sometimes chooses the most unlikely figures to outshine all others. As the night deepens, you leave the Valley of the Kings, stars glittering above. The desert is quiet, the river a dark ribbon in the distance. Tutankhamun's name fades from his own time, erased by successors eager to forget the Amarna line. Yet history will return to him. His golden face becomes Egypt's eternal symbol. And you, pausing at the valley's edge, sense the boy king's whisper. Sometimes it is not power, but preservation that makes one immortal.
The desert wind sharpens, carrying whispers of grandeur. Egypt, still glowing from its restoration, now swells to near mythic proportions under one man's name, Ramesses II, remembered as Ramesses the Great. His reign stretches over 6 decades, longer than many Egyptians lived, and you step into a time when monuments seem to sprout from the earth itself, each stone shouting the king's glory. From the moment he ascends the throne, Ramesses pours energy into building. At Thebes, the Ramesseum rises, colossal statues of the king seated like a god, his gaze fixed across eternity. At Luxor, he expands the Great Temple. Most spectacular of all, at Abu Simbel, he carves mountains into sanctuaries. You walk into the Grand Hall, where 4 seated giants, each over 60 feet tall, guard the entrance. Twice a year, the rising sun pierces through the doorway, illuminating the inner sanctuary. It is astronomy in stone, precision married to divinity. Your key fact here? Ramesses II was Egypt's greatest builder, his monuments still towering after 3,000 years. You wander through battle reliefs that trumpet his victories. The most famous is at Kadesh, where Ramesses faced the Hittites in what many call the first recorded battle in history. Chariots thunder, arrows darken the sky, and in the reliefs, Ramesses charges alone into the fray, scattering enemies like frightened birds. You might chuckle, knowing kings never resist exaggeration. Historians still wonder whether Kadesh was a triumph or a stalemate, for the records from both Egypt and Hatti boast of victory. Yet what matters is not the fact, but the memory. Ramesses is etched as the warrior par excellence. Diplomacy follows war. You stand before the world's first known peace treaty, signed between Egypt and the Hittites, carved in hieroglyphs and cuneiform alike. It declares eternal brotherhood, alliance, and even a royal marriage to seal the deal. Imagine parchment sealed with handshakes, but here it is stone declaring cooperation. That treaty, remarkably, survives both as artifact and as a concept, proof that nations long ago understood the value of words as much as swords. At home, Ramesses builds not only temples for gods, but for his family. His chief queen, Nefertari, rests in one of the most exquisite tombs in the Valley of the Queens.
You enter it and see walls painted with dazzling colors, goddesses guiding her through the afterlife, stars twinkling on ceilings as if the sky itself followed her underground. The affection carved into those walls is tender, rare in its clarity. Ramesses adored her. One cultural tidbit blooms here. The tomb's art is so vivid that modern visitors still gasp at its beauty, as if stepping into a dream, untouched by time. Ramesses fathers dozens of children, so many that statues and reliefs show long rows of princes and princesses. The palace hums with life, each child a thread in his claim to eternity. You might joke that he practically invented the world's first overcrowded family portrait. And yet, behind the grandeur, subtle cracks begin to show. The wealth of Egypt, stretched by constant building, strains to keep pace. Temples and officials grow powerful, grain reserves thin. Historians still wonder whether Ramesses' splendor masked deeper fragility. Perhaps the grandeur was partly illusion. Stone walls strong enough to conceal the weakening bones of empire. Still, when you stand at Abu Simbel at sunset, watching the statues glow crimson against the desert cliffs, you cannot deny the impact. Ramesses II, more than almost any ruler before or after, imprints himself on Egypt's very skin. His name, his face, his feats are written on temples, obelisks, and walls across the land. Even centuries later, Greeks will call him Ozymandias, the King of Kings. His boast may one day crumble, but the echo of his ambition still hums in the desert air. As the night wraps around the monuments, you sense his whisper through stone. Greatness is not only measured in victories, but in what endures. And Ramesses, the great builder, ensured his shadow would stretch far beyond his lifetime.
The colossal statues of Ramesses fade behind you, but the desert does not rest. A new storm brews on the horizon, one not of kingship or glory, but of survival. Egypt, once the master of chariots and empire, now finds itself battered by forces even its mighty pharaohs cannot fully contain. You step carefully into the late New Kingdom, where the sea peoples arrive and decline takes hold. It begins with murmurs of unrest. To the north, whole regions churn with upheaval. Tribes, migrants, and raiders on the move. They come by sea, waves of unknown origin, bringing with them new weapons, strange helmets, and warships that cut across the Mediterranean like blades. The Egyptians call them the Sea Peoples, and though historians still wonder who exactly they were, Philistines, Sardinians, Mycenaean refugees, or a mix of all, they know their impact was seismic. You stand beside Ramesses III, the last great warrior pharaoh of the 20th dynasty, as he prepares to meet this threat. Reliefs at Medinet Habu still show the drama. Chariots racing along the shore, archers unleashing volleys, Egyptian ships ramming invaders in chaotic naval clashes. The sea peoples tumble into the water, tangled in nets, while Ramesses stands larger than life, drawing his bow. You might smile wryly at the propaganda. Pharaohs never lose on their own walls, but you sense the desperation behind the images. One key fact here: though Egypt repelled the Sea Peoples, the victory drained its strength. Grain supplies dwindled, the treasury sagged, and the empire shrank. The once proud frontier fortresses fell silent, and Egypt retreated to the safety of its own valley. As you wander through villages along the Nile, you see signs of strain. Grain rations are smaller. Workers complain in loud voices. At Deir el-Medina, the community of tomb builders, you hear something unprecedented: Egypt's first recorded labor strike. The artisans lay down their tools, demanding overdue wages of bread and beer. Their petitions, scratched on ostraca, read like echoes of a modern protest. You might chuckle, imagining workers holding painted signs, "No bread, no work." Yet beneath the humor lies a truth. When even tomb builders strike, the system is faltering. Religion shifts too. The temples of Amun at Karnak and Luxor grow vast and wealthy, their priests holding more land than the crown. Some say the pharaoh now serves the temple, rather than the temple serving the pharaoh. Historians still debate whether the priests drained resources or simply filled the vacuum of weak kingship. Either way, the balance tilts, and royal power diminishes. Cultural tidbits flicker even in decline. Scribes still copy wisdom literature, artists still paint lively scenes of banquets and musicians, and families still place Shabti figurines in tombs to serve the dead in the afterlife. Egypt does not lose its identity, it simply tightens it, retreating inward as the outside world grows rougher. You travel to the delta and feel the tension. Libyans pressing in from the west, Nubians restless in the south. Foreign mercenaries appear in Egyptian armies, their accents strange, but their pay in grain the same. Egypt, once conqueror, now hires outsiders to defend its soil. Historians still wonder if drought, earthquakes, or famine across the eastern Mediterranean triggered the collapse of many great powers: the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, even parts of Mesopotamia. Egypt survived when others fell, but survival came at a cost. No longer the expansive empire of Thutmose or Ramesses II, Egypt clung to the Nile like a reed bending in the wind. At dusk, you walk through the ruins of Medinet Habu, where carved reliefs still trumpet triumph against the sea peoples. The stones glow in the fading light, but the silence beyond the walls tells another story. An empire shrunk, weary, and bruised. You breathe the desert air and realize Egypt is entering an age of fragility. Its monuments still tall, but its heart heavy with decline.
The night deepens, and the Nile seems quieter now, flowing not with the roar of empire, but with a hum of endurance. Egypt, weary from battles with the sea peoples and from priests who rival kings, now faces a startling twist in its story. Rulers from beyond its borders will wear the double crown. You step into the third intermediate period, where Nubian pharaohs from Kush rise to restore what Egypt itself has begun to lose. To the south, beyond the First Cataract, lies Nubia, a land Egyptians long considered both a neighbor and a prize. They mined its gold, hired its archers, and built fortresses to hold it. Yet Nubia had its own strong culture, its own gods, and its own proud kings. Over time, Egyptian influence sank deep into Nubia. Temples rose in Egyptian style, hieroglyphs were carved, and deities like Amun were worshipped alongside native ones. You might smile at how cultural borrowing flows both ways. Egypt once ruled Nubia, and now Nubia returns the gesture. One key fact here: in the 8th century BCE, Nubian kings of Kush conquered Egypt, forming the 25th dynasty. You stand beside Pi, sometimes called Pienki, who marches north from Napata.
His inscriptions describe his devotion to Amun and his disdain for Egyptian lords who had grown soft, corrupt, and divided. At Memphis, he accepts the surrender of Egypt's chiefs, not as a brutal conqueror, but as a pious restorer. His words still echo, "Egypt must live by Ma'at again." Historians still wonder whether the Nubian conquest was seen by ordinary Egyptians as foreign domination or as a revival of their oldest traditions. After all, the Kushite kings embraced Egyptian culture with zeal. They built pyramids in Nubia, smaller and steeper than those of Giza, yet clear echoes of that ancient form. They restored temples at Thebes, honored Amun, and portrayed themselves in the age-old poses of pharaohs. To many, it may have felt less like invasion and more like a circle completing itself. In Thebes, you watch priests welcome these southern kings, their rituals thick with incense. The Kushites fund temple building, strengthen worship of Amun, and revive ceremonies that had languished. A cultural tidbit glimmers here. The Nubians considered Jebel Barkal, a mountain near Napata, to be the sacred home of Amun. They believed it was a divine birthplace, linking their land to Egypt's holiest traditions. In their hands, Egypt's religion not only survived, but was rekindled. Still, the age is not without tension. Libyan dynasties continue to rule parts of Egypt, creating a patchwork of authority. Foreign powers, Assyrians especially, loom to the northeast, watching with interest. Egypt is no longer the unstoppable force it once was. Now, it is a land to be contested. Yet, in this contest, Nubian pharaohs carve out a legacy of dignity, insisting that Egypt's ancient soul still matters. You wander through the temple precinct of Karnak as Nubian kings leave their inscriptions. Their names join the long line of rulers stretching back to Narmer. You pause at the carved image of Taharka, perhaps the most famous of them all, standing tall in reliefs across Nubia and Egypt. He sponsors great works, strengthens defenses, and for a brief time restores Egypt's pride. Historians still debate whether Taharka's rule was golden or precarious. He faced the Assyrians, who struck hard at Egypt's delta, and though he resisted, the pressure was immense. Yet his presence endures. Biblical texts even mention him, proof of his reach beyond the Nile. At dusk, you stand among the Nubian pyramids at El Kuru and Nuri, their pointed silhouettes against the desert sky. They are humbler than Giza, but their message is the same: kings seeking eternity through stone. You realize that Egypt's story is no longer just Egypt. It is shared, expanded, and carried forward by neighbors who once stood at its edges. The Nile whispers in the dark. Power shifts, crowns change, but the current endures. Egypt, now ruled by sons of Cush, is still Egypt, still reaching for the balance of Ma'at in a world that grows ever more turbulent.
The desert wind carries new footsteps, foreign and unrelenting. Egypt, long accustomed to ruling others, now finds itself increasingly ruled. You step into an age of shadows, when Persians, Greeks, and others leave their stamp on the Nile, shaping its destiny in ways both heavy and surprising. First come the Persians. In the 6th century BCE, Cambyses II of Persia sweeps in,
his armies pressing Egypt into the vast Achaemenid Empire. To Egyptians, this feels both humiliating and bewildering. A pharaoh who is not born of the Nile now wears the double crown. Some locals resist, others adapt, and Persian satraps govern with a foreign hand. Taxes grow heavier, temples are watched, and the air thickens with unease. Yet Persia also brings stability and vast connections, linking Egypt to lands as far as India. You might smile at the irony. Egyptians grumble about foreign rulers even as they benefit from empire-wide trade in gold, grain, and horses. Historians still wonder whether Persian rule was uniformly harsh or more pragmatic than Egyptians like to admit. Records from priests depict tyranny and sacrilege, but Persian sources tell of investment and reform. Perhaps both are true. Memory tends to exaggerate its wounds. Then, after centuries of shifting rule, a thunderbolt strikes. Alexander the Great. You walk beside him as he enters Egypt in 332 BCE, greeted not as a conqueror, but as a liberator from Persian dominance. In Memphis, he is crowned pharaoh, and in the temple of Amun at Siwa Oasis, he is declared son of the god. One key fact here: Alexander's arrival marks the beginning of Egypt's Hellenistic age, a blending of Greek and Egyptian traditions. You travel north with him to the Mediterranean coast, where he lays the foundations of a new city, Alexandria. It will become one of the most dazzling cities of the ancient world, home to the Great Library and the towering Pharaohs lighthouse. Imagine scrolls from across civilizations gathered here, knowledge humming in every corridor, while the beacon at the harbor guides ships from distant shores. Egypt, once the teacher, now becomes the crossroads of learning. After Alexander's sudden death, his empire fragments, and Egypt falls under the rule of the Ptolemies, Greek kings who adopt Egyptian symbols. You see Ptolemy I crowned as pharaoh, though he speaks Greek in court. His descendants commission temples in the traditional style, honoring Horus and Isis, even as their coins bear Greek profiles. You might chuckle. It's as though they wore two costumes at once: Greek robes in the palace, Egyptian crowns in the temple. One cultural tidbit shines here. Under the Ptolemies, Egyptian religion flourishes anew, but in hybrid forms. The god Serapis emerges, a blend of Osiris and Greek deities, an attempt to unify subjects under a shared faith. In the marketplace, you hear Greek and Egyptian spoken side by side, and in theaters, Homer's verses echo, even as priests chant hymns to Ra. Historians still wonder how ordinary Egyptians felt about their Greek rulers. Did they see them as foreign overlords, or did the blending of cultures soften the divide? Evidence suggests both. Resentment, but trade and prosperity also grew. Alexandria itself became a marvel. Yet deep in the countryside, Egyptians clung fiercely to their older traditions. You wander the corridors of the Library of Alexandria, shelves groaning with scrolls, works of science, philosophy, poetry. Imagine scribes copying Euclid's geometry, astronomers charting the stars, and physicians dissecting bodies to learn their secrets. Egypt, though politically changed, becomes an intellectual furnace, its light reaching across the Mediterranean. At dusk, you walk the harbor of Alexandria. The Pharaohs lighthouse glows, one of the 7 wonders, casting its beam across restless seas. Behind you, Greek columns rise, Ahead, the desert still whispers with ancient gods. Egypt is no longer entirely Egyptian. It's crowned worn by Persians, then Greeks, but it remains enduring, adaptable, and strangely luminous.
The harbor of Alexandria glimmers under the Mediterranean sun, but the horizon darkens with the sails of Rome. Egypt, already transformed by Persian and Greek hands, now faces its final chapter as an independent kingdom. You step into the world of Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh, whose story blends politics, love, and tragedy into one of history's most enduring dramas. Cleopatra does not fit the easy mold of ruler. She is learned, speaking several languages, trained in philosophy, medicine, and politics. You might smile at how she even mastered Egyptian, unlike many of her Ptolemaic ancestors who clung to Greek. One key fact steadies here. Cleopatra was the last pharaoh to truly embody both the Greek and Egyptian worlds, ruling not only as queen, but as living goddess. You walk with her into Alexandria's marble palaces, their columns gleaming, mosaics glittering, and gardens perfumed with exotic blooms. Yet beyond these walls, Egypt trembles. Rome has grown too powerful, its generals meddling in the Nile's affairs. Cleopatra knows that survival does not on isolation, but on alliance. Her story twines with Julius Caesar. You picture her dramatic entrance. Legend says she rolled herself in a carpet, unfurled before him like a gift. Whether myth or truth, the gesture worked. Together, they form an alliance, and Caesar's stay in Egypt sparks gossip from Rome to the Red Sea. A child is born, Caesarion, presented as heir to both lineages. After Caesar's assassination, the stage shifts. Cleopatra binds herself to Mark Antony, the Roman general whose charisma rivals her own. Their partnership is not only romantic, but strategic. Together, they envision a Mediterranean carved between Rome and Egypt, east and west balanced in power. In Alexandria, banquets shimmer with gold and silver, and poets sing of the inimitable livers, a couple dazzling in their extravagance. You might chuckle at how even ancient power couples had their tabloids. But in Rome, Octavian, later Augustus, sees danger. Propaganda paints Cleopatra as a seductress, Antony as her puppet, Egypt as a threat to Roman virtue. Historians still debate how much of Cleopatra's image as temptress was truth and how much was Rome's smear campaign. What is clear is the outcome, the fateful clash at Actium in 31 BCE. You stand on the shoreline, watching sails clash and ships burn. Antony and Cleopatra's forces falter, retreat, and finally scatter. They flee back to Egypt, where the end approaches like an eclipse. In Alexandria, defeat hangs heavy. Antony falls on his sword. Cleopatra, defiant to the last, chooses death by her own hand. Legend says it was the bite of an asp, though historians still wonder if poison was more likely. The details blur, but the final image endures. The queen who refused to be paraded through Rome as a trophy. Rome takes Egypt, and with it, the long line of pharaohs ends. The double crown is set aside. The Nile becomes a province of empire. Yet Cleopatra's shadow lingers, vivid and unyielding.
Her story will echo in plays, poems, and films. Her face carved on coins and imagined on countless canvases. One cultural tidbit to hold: under Roman rule, Egypt remained the empire's breadbasket, its grain feeding Rome's hungry millions. The Nile still pulsed with life, though its destiny was no longer its own. As the desert night falls, you look back across the vast story you have walked. From reed huts along the first Nile settlements, through pyramids, invasions, golden ages, and revolutions, to the tragic end of Cleopatra, Egypt has evolved through millennia. Its monuments endure, its myths linger, its river still flows. Egypt is both ancient and eternal, a land where time bends and history whispers through sand and stone. Now, slow your breathing, let the stars soften, and allow this journey to fade into quiet. Wind down. The story of Egypt, so long and so luminous, now drifts into stillness. You lie back in the hush of the desert night, pyramids dark against the horizon, temples silent beneath the moon. The Nile flows gently, no longer carrying armies or barges of treasure, but only the timeless murmur of water, returning again and again. The noise of pharaohs fades. Their triumphs and failures, their boasts carved in stone, dissolve into a soft memory. You are left with the enduring rhythm of life. Farmers sowing seed, children splashing in the river, families whispering prayers to gods both old and new. That rhythm carries across dynasties, across centuries, as steady as your own breathing now. The monuments you passed, Saqqara, Giza, Karnak, Abu Simbel, stand silent, their sharp edges blurred by sand and time. Even in their silence, they keep watch, like sentinels guiding the weary into rest. You imagine lying within one of those vast halls, stars painted on the ceiling above, as though the sky itself leaned close to guard your sleep. Let your mind ease away from battles and coronations. Let the echoes of chariots and hymns soften into a distant hum. The story is no longer urgent. It is gentle, like the Nile at night, carrying you slowly toward dreams. And now you may drift into dreams of history.